At 92 years old, living in my son Julian's sprawling coastal estate felt less like a retirement and more like a slow, chilly march toward an inevitable silence. The walls were white, the floors were cold marble, and the air always smelled of expensive citrus cleaner, a scent that tried to mask the fact that I was a decaying relic in a house built for the future. Julian barely spoke to me anymore. I had become a piece of furniture, a dusty heirloom that no one knew where to place. I spent my days drifting between my bed and the velvet chair by the window, watching the tide go out and wondering if I would go out with it. Then came that Tuesday morning. The air was unusually still when Julian walked into my room. He wasn't wearing his usual mask of professional stress or the tight-lipped grimace of duty. Instead, he carried a tall glass of vibrant, thick green juice, and on his face was a smile I hadn't seen in 5 years, a smile that looked like the son I used to know. He told me he'd stayed up researching nutrition, that he'd made this specifically to give me back my strength and vitality. My heart, which had been a cold stone for months, suddenly swelled with a hope so sharp it felt like a sting. I thought, finally, my son loves me again. But behind that radiant, caring smile was a darkness so calculated it would shatter our lives forever. Because when I looked at him and casually mentioned that his wife, Elena, had already finished a glass just like it downstairs, his entire world didn't just crack, it collapsed. He began to panic in a way that revealed a horror I was never meant to survive. Before I reveal the terrifying truth of what happened in that kitchen, please take a moment to tell me where in the world you are watching from today. Your support helps these stories reach those who need to hear them. Subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. At 92, living in Julian's house felt like existing as a ghost that everyone was too polite to exorcise, but too uncomfortable to acknowledge. I was a phantom in a three-piece suit, shuffling through hallways that felt miles long. My room was a beautiful cage. Julian had given me the largest guest suite, overlooking the ocean, but the view only served to remind me of how vast the world was and how small my life had become. I would sit for hours, my hands trembling in my lap, listening to the muffled sounds of a life I was no longer invited to lead. Julian was a man of industry, a titan of commercial development, or so I thought. When we did speak, it was never about the past or my feelings or the stories I carried from nearly a century of living. Our interactions were reduced to a series of clinical, practical questions. Did you take the blue pill, Father? Is the thermostat high enough? Have you finished your porridge? He never sat on the edge of my bed. He never asked what I dreamed about. He treated my existence like a recurring line item on a budget, an expense that had to be managed until it could finally be cleared from the books. Then there was Elena. My daughter-in-law was a woman of sharp edges and expensive tastes. She didn't just ignore me. She actively avoided the space I occupied. I would enter a room, my walker clicking rhythmically against the stone, and I would watch her spine stiffen. She would find a reason to leave, a phone call, a forgotten item, a sudden need to check on the gardens. She made it clear through every sigh and every averted gaze that my presence in their $15 million mansion was a heavy, unwelcome weight she only carried because the world was watching. I felt invisible. I felt like a stain on a perfect white canvas. I would hear them downstairs, the clinking of wine glasses and the bright, genuine peals of laughter. They were happy, but that happiness was a private club, and I wasn't on the guest list. The moment I would shuffle into the dining room, the laughter would die, replaced by a polite silence that felt heavier than any insult. I eventually started taking my meals alone in my room. It was easier than watching them count the seconds until I finished my soup, so they could return to being a family of two. The loneliness was a physical weight, a crushing pressure in my chest that no medication could touch. I had survived 9 decades, navigated the loss of my wife when Julian was just a boy, and built an empire from nothing, only to end up a prisoner of my own success. I began to regret the pride, that made me refuse the assisted living facilities Julian had suggested months ago. At least there, I might have found a peer, someone to trade stories with, someone who didn't look at me and see a deadline. But Julian had insisted. He told me it was the right thing for a son to care for his father. Now, I realized his insistence wasn't born of love, but of a need to keep his prize close. That Tuesday began with the same gray monotony as 1,000 days before it. I woke at 7, the sun just beginning to burn through the coastal fog. I dressed slowly, a ritual of dignity that took me nearly an hour. I heard the house come to life. The distant hum of the espresso machine, the sharp click of Elena's heels, the low murmur of the morning news. I stayed in my chair. I didn't want to ruin their morning with my slow movements. I just sat by the window, waiting for the next milestone of a meaningless day. At 9 o'clock, there was a knock. Julian entered. He was holding that glass, a deep, opaque green. He looked me in the eye and told me he had spent the morning juicing kale, ginger, and lemon. He said he wanted me to feel like myself again. He handed me the glass, and for a fleeting, beautiful moment, I felt the warmth of a son's care. I held the cold glass in my gnarled hands, tears pricking my eyes. I was ready to drink every drop, simply because he had made it for me. I was ready to swallow his love, even if it was bitter. But as the glass reached my lips, a stray memory stopped me. I remembered seeing Elena in the kitchen just 30 minutes prior, her hand wrapped around a glass exactly like this one. I lowered the drink and smiled at my son, telling him how wonderful it was that the whole family was finally sharing the same healthy habits. I told him I'd seen Elena drinking hers already. I didn't know then that my son was a man standing on the edge of a precipice, and I was the one he intended to push. What I didn't know while I sat there, cradling that cold glass and basking in the phantom warmth of my son's gaze, was that Julian was not the successful man the world believed him to be. While I had been staring out my window at the ocean, Julian had been staring into the abyss of his own making. He was drowning. The coastal mansion, the fleet of European cars, the private galleries, and the high society galas were all a shimmering facade built on a foundation of sand that was rapidly washing away. Julian had ventured into high-stakes commercial real estate during a volatile market shift. He had taken massive, unsecured loans to fund a series of luxury developments that now sat half-finished and abandoned, rotting in the sun. He didn't just owe money. He owed more than $2 million to aggressive private creditors and institutional banks that had lost their patience. They were no longer sending polite letters. They were threatening to seize this very house, to strip him of his reputation, and to cast him into the street. He was a man who defined himself by his wealth, and without it, he felt he was nothing. The only thing standing between Julian and total ruin was my estate. Over 60 years of labor in commercial development, I had accumulated a fortune worth $15 million. It was tied up in waterfront holdings in Florida, a diversified portfolio of blue-chip stocks, and liquid cash reserve that I had intended to leave to him when my time naturally came. To Julian, that $15 million wasn't a legacy. It was a life raft. He had spent the last several months obsessively meeting with his attorneys, dissecting the terms of my will and the structure of my living trust. He knew that upon the moment of my passing, every cent would transfer to him instantly. But at 92 years old, I was an inconvenient miracle. Despite my slow pace and my walker, my heart was strong and my mind was sharp. My doctors often joked that I had the constitution of a man 20 years younger and could easily see my 97th birthday. For Julian, 5 years was an eternity he couldn't afford. His creditors were demanding payment within 30 days. He viewed my continued survival as a personal insult to his financial survival. He didn't see a father anymore. He saw a biological safe deposit box that refused to open. The plan had formed in the dark corners of his desperation. He had spent weeks in his home office, late into the night, cleared of his history, researching the vulnerabilities of the elderly. He looked for ways to induce a natural end, something that would bypass the prying eyes of a coroner. He discovered that certain toxins, when administered to a man of 92, would mimic the symptoms of a standard cardiac event or a stroke. He settled on a high-grade, concentrated rat poison. It was a brutal, ancient substance, but in the right dosage, it caused internal hemorrhaging and systemic failure that a rush doctor would simply attribute to advanced age. He had purchased the poison in cash at a hardware store 3 towns over, wearing a hat and sunglasses, feeling like a spy in a movie rather than a son planning a murder. He had meticulously calculated the timing. He needed a window where Elena would be out of the house at her morning yoga class, giving him time to administer the medicine and then discover me hours later. He wanted to be the one to call the paramedics, to play the role of the grieving, shocked son who had just brought his father a healthy breakfast. The green juice was his masterpiece of deception. The thick, pulpy texture of the blended kale and spinach was designed to hide the graininess of the poison, and the sharp, spicy bite of the ginger and lemon was meant to mask the chemical bitterness of the toxin. He had spent the morning in the kitchen, carefully measuring the white powder into the blender, watching it disappear into the vibrant green liquid. He had stirred it with a shaking hand, whispering to himself that he was doing this for his family, for Elena, and for their future. He had convinced himself that my life was already over, and he was simply accelerating the inevitable to save those who still had a life to live. As he stood in my doorway, that mask of warmth was his final performance. He had practiced that smile in the hallway mirror, adjusting the corners of his mouth to look just kind enough, just genuine enough to ensure I wouldn't hesitate. He wanted my final memory to be one of reconciliation. He wanted me to die with a heart full of gratitude, never knowing that the man I had raised had become my executioner. He was prepared to watch me take the first sip. He was prepared to sit by my side and watch the light go out of my eyes, all while thinking about the $15 million that would soon be flowing into his empty accounts. But the architecture of his perfect crime had one fatal flaw. He hadn't accounted for the simple, mundane routines of his wife. I held the glass, the condensation chilling my palms. "It's so kind of you, Julian," I said, my voice cracking with genuine emotion. "Truly, I saw Elena drinking her juice in the kitchen about 20 minutes ago, and I thought how nice it was that you were taking care of both of us. She seemed to be enjoying hers quite a bit." I didn't see the glass. I only saw Julian's face. In an instant, the mask of the loving son vanished, shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. The blood fled from his cheeks with a suddenness that was violent, leaving him a ghastly, sallow gray, the color of a man already mourning his own soul. His eyes didn't just widen. They bulged with a primal, visceral terror, the pupils shrinking to pinpricks as they fixed on the empty space where his plan had once been perfect. His breath became a ragged, wet gasp, a desperate rattle in his throat, as if he were the one already choking on the toxin. He looked at me, then at the lethal glass still sitting between us, and then toward the door with a jerky, panicked movement. His mind was clearly racing through a horrific realization, replaying every second of his morning, searching for the moment he had left the tainted pitcher within her reach. He believed that in his haste, or through some terrible accident of placement, Elena had found the poison batch he had prepared for me. The silence in the room became deafening, thick with the smell of his cold sweat and the underlying scent of bitter almonds. It was broken only by the rhythmic, frantic sound of Julian's teeth beginning to chatter, a sound like dry bones clicking together. The greed was gone. He wasn't thinking about the $15 million or the freedom it promised anymore. He was trapped in a private purgatory, thinking only about his wife, the one person he actually loved, the anchor of his wretched world, dying in agony on the kitchen floor because of his own hand. The silence that rushed back into the room was heavier than before, thick with the metallic scent of the spilled elixir. I looked down at the emerald smudge on my shirt. It was darkening, turning a bruised, sickly shade of black in the dim library light. My hands were shaking. Julian had always been a man of controlled movements and measured breaths, a shadow of the vibrant boy he once was. To see him snap, to see that raw, primal terror, was like watching a statue suddenly scream. I stood up, my knees buckling slightly, and followed the trail of green droplets toward the hallway. His cries for Elena were fading, replaced by a frantic, rhythmic sobbing that seemed to echo from the very walls. As I reached the top of the grand staircase, I saw him. He was collapsed against the door of their suite, his forehead pressed against the dark mahogany, his hands trembling so violently the empty glass rattled against the floorboards. "Julian?" I whispered, my voice sounding small in the vastness of the corridor. He didn't turn. "You don't understand," he rasped, the words catching in a throat constricted by panic. "You brought it back. You've brought the hunger back into this house." He finally looked at me, and the expression in his eyes wasn't anger. It was the hollow, wide-eyed stare of a man who had seen the end of the world and was simply waiting for the fire to reach him. He looked at the green stain on my chest as if it were a mark of death. "She can't have it," he hissed, his voice dropping to a terrifying, conspiratorial level. "If she tastes it, the silence ends. And God help us, Father, I can't survive the noise again." A dark, cold instinct began to stir in the back of my mind, a whisper of the truth that I was too terrified to fully hear. I knew I couldn't stay in that chair. My legs were weak, and my joints ached with the fire of 92 years. But the adrenaline of fear gave me a temporary, fragile strength. I reached for my walker, my hands shaking so violently that the metal frame rattled against the floor. I pushed myself up, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Step by agonizing step, I began the long journey toward the stairs. As I reached the landing, the sound from the kitchen became clearer, and there were the sounds of a world ending. I heard the unmistakable crash of glassware hitting the marble floor, a sharp, explosive sound followed by the wet thud of liquid. I heard Elena's voice, sharp and piercing, filled with a mixture of confusion and burgeoning alarm. "Julian, what are you doing? Are you out of your mind? You're hurting me. Did you drink it?" Julian was sobbing now, the words muffled by gasps for air. "Tell me the truth, Elena. How much did you have? Did you finish the glass?" "I don't know what you're talking about," she screamed back. "It was just juice, Julian. Get away from me. You're terrifying me." I began the descent, my white knuckles gripping the banister until the wood dug into my palms. Each step down the grand staircase felt like a descent into an abyss. I felt every one of my 92 years in the protest of my knees, but the terror driving me was swifter than any physical decay. I could see the layout of the kitchen below, a space I usually avoided, now transformed into a stage for a tragedy I was only beginning to comprehend. The air felt thick, charged with a frantic energy that made the hair on my arms stand up. When I finally reached the bottom and shuffled toward the kitchen doorway, I stopped, paralyzed by the scene before me. The kitchen, usually a pristine temple of modern design, was a battlefield. Shards of glass littered the floor, reflecting the morning sun in 1,000 jagged points. A massive pool of green liquid spread across the white island counter, dripping slowly onto the floor. Julian was on his knees, his expensive suit trousers soaked in the mess. He was holding Elena's face in his hands, his thumbs pressing into her cheeks with a frantic, terrifying intensity. He was searching her eyes, his own wide and bloodshot, looking for the first signs of the death he had meticulously packaged in a glass. He looked like a man trying to hold back the ocean with his bare hands, his face a mask of sweating, trembling desperation. "Tell me," he whispered, a long string of saliva hanging from his lip. "Tell me you didn't swallow it. Please, Elena. I can't. I can't lose you. Not like this. Not because of me." Elena was trembling, her back pressed against the high-end refrigerator. She looked at her husband, as if he had been replaced by a monster. "It was just the green juice I make every morning, Julian," she whimpered, her voice small and broken. I made it myself. I used the spinach and the apples. Why are you acting like this? What did you do? Julian didn't answer. He slumped forward, his forehead resting against the cool cabinet doors, and began to wail. It was the sound of a man who had already seen his own ghost. He fumbled in his pocket, pulling out his phone with hands that seemed unable to function. He dropped it once, twice, the screen cracking against the stone, before he finally managed to swipe the emergency call button. "I need an ambulance," he gasped into the phone, his voice a ragged shadow of its former self. "My wife, she's been poisoned. It was the rat poison. I put it in the juice. She wasn't supposed to. It was for—" He stopped. The air in the kitchen seemed to vanish. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine as I stood in the doorway, hunched over my walker. The silence that followed was more violent than any scream. In that moment, the confession hung in the air like a thick, poisonous fog. He had said it. He had told the world, and he had told me. I felt the $15 million of my estate turn into 15 million tons of lead, crushing the life out of me. The staggering weight of his greed made it hard to draw breath. It was a physical pressure that seemed to sap the very heat from my blood. My son, the boy I had raised alone after his mother's heart gave out when he was 7, had just admitted to the state of California and to his own father that he had intended to murder me for a check. The sheer cruelty of the betrayal vibrated through the metal of my walker, a cold shock that traveled from the floorboards right into my soul. The kitchen grew so quiet that I could hear the rhythmic dripping of the green liquid falling from the marble island onto the floor. It sounded like a clock ticking away the final seconds of our family's life. Julian remained on his knees, his phone lying on the floor between his shaking legs. From a speaker, a tinny, robotic voice, the emergency dispatcher, kept repeating the same phrase. "Sir? Sir, I need you to confirm your address. You said someone has ingested rat poison. Sir, are you there?" Julian didn't move. He looked like a man who had been turned to stone at the very moment of his greatest sin. His eyes were locked onto mine, and for the first time in months, I didn't see the polite silence or the unwelcome burdened look. I saw the raw, naked terror of a predator who had accidentally caught his own heart in the trap he'd set for another. Elena was the first to break the paralysis. She let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. She pushed herself away from the counter, stumbling over a piece of broken glass, her eyes darting between Julian and the second, untouched glass that sat further down the counter, the one Julian had prepared with such loving care. "You put it in the juice?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a realization so heavy it seemed to choke her. "Julian, look at me. Who did you put in the juice for?" Julian's mouth worked, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish gasping for water. He turned his head slowly, almost mechanically, to look at me. The betrayal was so thick in the room I could taste it, a metallic, bitter tang that no amount of ginger could ever cover. "It was for me," I said. My voice didn't sound like my own. It was thin and brittle like old parchment. "Wasn't it, Julian? You brought that glass to my room with a smile because you wanted me to die thinking you finally cared again." The weight of my words seemed to physically crush him. Julian slumped further, his hands pressing into the spilled juice on the floor. "The debts, Dad," he moaned, his voice a pathetic whimper. "The creditors. They were going to take everything. The house, the cars. Elena's life. I didn't have a choice. You're 92. You had your life. I just needed the 15 million to start over." Elena let out a sharp, horrified gasp. "The 15 million? You tried to kill your father for the inheritance?" She looked at him with a revulsion so deep it was as if she were seeing a maggot crawling out of a piece of fine silk. "I've been making my own juice every morning for 3 years, Julian. I made a fresh pitcher at 8:30. I never touched your glass. I never would have touched it." She ran to the counter and grabbed her own pitcher, holding it up like a shield. "See? This is mine. Spinach, Cucumber, apple. I pour my glass from this. She then pointed a shaking finger at the lone, tall glass sitting near the refrigerator. The one Julian had carefully spiked with enough rat poison to stop a heart. That one. That was the one you made. That was the one you were going to use to murder your own father. Julian began to weep. Not the tears of a man who was sorry for what he had done, but the tears of a man who was sorry he had been caught. He reached out for Elena's hem, but she recoiled as if he were a leper. "Don't touch me," she hissed. "You're a monster. You sat at dinner with him. You watched him struggle with his walker. You helped him into his chair, all while you were planning how much poison it would take to melt his insides. How could you? How could you be my husband?" I felt a strange, cold clarity wash over me. The pain was there, somewhere deep inside, but it was buried under a mountain of shock. I looked at my son, the boy I had shielded from the world, the man I had given every advantage, every penny, every ounce of my strength. I realized that the burden he felt wasn't my age or my slow movements. The burden was my heartbeat. Every time my heart pumped, it was a second longer he had to wait for his money. The emergency operator was still talking. "Sir, I have dispatched units to your location. They are 3 minutes away. Do not attempt to induce vomiting. Is the victim conscious?" Julian looked at the phone, then at me, then at the poison glass. The collapsed life he was experiencing wasn't just about his finances anymore. It was the total disintegration of his soul. He had confessed on a recorded line. He had confessed in front of his wife. He had confessed to the man he tried to kill. "I'm still here," I said, my voice growing stronger, fueled by a cold, ancient anger. "I'm still breathing, Julian. And I'm going to make sure I'm still breathing when they take you away from here in handcuffs." The sound of the sirens began as a faint wail in the distance, cutting through the heavy, stagnant air of the mansion. It was a sound I had heard many times in my 92 years, but never had it sounded so much like a bell tolling for a funeral. Not my funeral, as Julian had meticulously planned, but the funeral of his freedom. As the blue and red lights began to pulse against the kitchen's white marble walls, reflecting off the shards of broken glass, the reality of the situation finally seemed to anchor itself in Julian's shattered mind. He didn't try to run. He didn't try to clean up the evidence. He simply sat there in the middle of the green puddle, his head bowed, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. The titan of industry, the man who dreamed of a $15 million salvation, was now just a broken middle-aged man shivering on a kitchen floor. The front door was thrown open, and the house was suddenly flooded with the heavy boots of first responders. Four paramedics rushed in, carrying orange trauma bags and a heart monitor, their faces set in masks of professional urgency. Behind them stood two police officers, their hands hovering near their belts, eyes scanning the room for the poisoner mentioned in the chaotic emergency call. "Where is the victim?" the lead paramedic shouted, his eyes landing on Elena, who was still trembling by the counter. "I'm fine," she choked out, pointing a shaking hand toward the floor. "I didn't drink it." But he tried. He admitted it. The paramedics shifted their focus to me. I stood there, leaning heavily on my walker, the green stain on my chest looking like a ghastly wound in the harsh LED light of their flashlights. They moved toward me with practiced efficiency, but I waved them off with a hand that had suddenly found its steadiness. "I didn't drink it either," I said, my voice echoing with a cold, hollow resonance. By the grace of God and a casual conversation, I am still standing. One of the police officers, a woman with sharp, observant eyes, walked over to the phone still lying on the floor. She picked it up, noting that the line to the dispatcher was still open. She then looked at the spilled juice, the shattered glass, and the lone, untouched glass sitting near the refrigerator. "Is that the substance?" she asked, her voice low and dangerous. Julian looked up, his face a map of ruin. "Yes," he whispered. "It's in that glass. And on the floor. It's the rat poison. The officer didn't hesitate. She stepped behind Julian, the metallic click of handcuffs echoing through the kitchen like a gunshot. As the steel rings tightened around his wrists, Julian didn't fight. He let out a long, shuddering breath, as if the weight of the $15 million had finally been lifted, replaced by the much heavier weight of his own soul. The paramedics insisted on checking my vitals. They sat me down in a kitchen chair, the very room where my death had been brewed. As they wrapped the blood pressure cuff around my thin arm, I watched the officers carefully bag the poison glass as evidence. I watched Elena walk to the far side of the kitchen, her arms wrapped around herself, refusing to look at the man she had called her husband. "Your heart rate is elevated, sir, but your rhythm is remarkably stable for someone who just went through this," the paramedic said, looking at me with a mixture of pity and awe. "I've survived a world war, the loss of my wife, and 9 decades of change," I replied, staring at Julian as he was led toward the door. "It takes more than a coward's juice to stop a heart that has actually loved someone." As Julian passed me, he stopped for a fleeting second. He looked as if he wanted to say something, an apology, a plea, a final lie, but no words came. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw that he finally understood what he had lost. He hadn't just lost the money. He had lost the only person in the world who would have given him everything if he had only asked with honesty instead of malice. The house grew quiet again as the police cars pulled away, taking my only son into the night. Elena stayed in the kitchen with me for a long time. She eventually came over and knelt by my walker, her eyes red and swollen. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I saw the distance, I saw the stress, but I never thought he was capable of this." "None of us did, Elena," I said, reaching out to pat her hand. "Greed is a poison that doesn't need a glass. It starts in the mind and eats everything until there's nothing left but shell." That night, I didn't stay in the mansion. I couldn't bear the cold silence of those marble halls anymore. I called a car and had them take me to a small, modest hotel in the city, a place that smelled of old carpets and cheap coffee, but felt infinitely warmer than the $15 million tomb Julian had built for me. As I lay in the hotel bed, listening to the hum of the city outside, I thought about the green juice. I thought about how close I came to closing my eyes forever, believing my son loved me. It was a beautiful lie, and in some ways, the truth was much harder to live with. But as I watched the sun begin to rise over the skyline, I realized that at 92, every breath is a gift, and I wasn't going to let a drop of poison ruin the time I had left. The legal proceedings would be long. The estate would be restructured. The mansion would be sold. But as the light filled the room, I felt a strange sense of peace. I was no longer a ghost. I was a man who had looked into the abyss and stepped back. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was waiting to die. I felt like I was finally ready to live. The first sunrise after the world collapses is always the coldest. I sat in that small hotel room, wrapped in a wool blanket that felt like lead against my thin frame. The bustling sounds of the city below, the distant honk of taxis, the hiss of bus brakes, the muffled chatter of people rushing to jobs they probably hated, all felt like transmissions from another planet. At 92 years old, I had lived through the Great Depression, seen empires rise and fall, and buried almost everyone I ever loved. But nothing in those 9 decades had prepared me for the hollow, echoing ache of realizing my only child had tried to erase me from existence. I looked at my hands. They were gnarled, the skin like translucent parchment over blue veins that map out a century of history. These hands had held Julian when he was a colicky infant. These hands had worked 16-hour shifts in the Florida heat to build the very foundation of the wealth he was so desperate to steal. I felt a surge of nauseating irony. Every penny of those $15 million was meant for him anyway. If he had only come to me, If he had only sat on the edge of my bed and said, "Father, I am drowning," I would have handed him the keys to the kingdom. I would have liquidated every asset to see him smile with genuine relief. But he didn't want the help. He wanted the inheritance. He didn't want the father. He wanted the ghost. The phone on the bedside table rang, its shrill tone cutting through my thoughts like a blade. It was the lead detective, a man named Henderson, whose voice sounded like he'd spent the last 20 years drinking cold coffee and looking at the worst of humanity. He informed me that the initial toxicology report on the green juice found in the kitchen was conclusive. It wasn't just rat poison. It was a concentrated professional-grade anticoagulant, a substance designed to ensure that even the smallest scratch would lead to an internal hemorrhage that couldn't be stopped. "Mr. Sterling," the detective said, his voice softening just a fraction. "The recorded 911 call is difficult to hear, but it's the strongest evidence we have. Your son's confession was spontaneous and detailed. He's being held without bail, given the flight risk and the nature of the crime." I thanked him and hung up. I didn't feel the triumph I expected. I didn't feel saved. I felt like a house that had been gutted by fire. The outer shell was still standing, but everything inside was ash. Later that afternoon, Elena came to see me. She looked like she hadn't slept in a week. The sharp edges I had always associated with her, the perfectly coiffed hair, the expensive jewelry, the guarded expression, had all vanished. She looked small, vulnerable, and deeply ashamed. She sat in the vinyl chair across from me, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. "The bank called this morning," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They've started the foreclosure process on the mansion. Julian hadn't paid the mortgage in 4 months. He'd been intercepting the mail, hiding the notices. I had no idea we were living in a house that didn't belong to us anymore." I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in years. We were both victims of the same man's vanity. "He was a good actor, Elena," I said. "He spent his whole life trying to be the man he thought I wanted him to be. He thought I valued the empire more than the heir. That was my failure as a father, perhaps." "No," she snapped, her eyes flashing with a sudden, protective fire. "Don't you dare take the blame for this. You didn't put that powder in the glass. You didn't practice a smile while you prepared a poison. That was him. That was all him." We sat in silence for a long time, watching the shadows lengthen across the hotel carpet. She told me that the police had found Julian's laptop. His search history was a descent into madness. He had been tracking my heart rate through the smartwatch he'd bought me for my birthday, the one he'd insisted I wear for my safety. He'd been waiting for a dip, for a sign of weakness, and when my heart kept beating with stubborn resilience, he decided to stop it himself. The horror of it was systematic. He hadn't just snapped. He had engineered a departure. He had looked at his 92-year-old father and seen a biological clock that he wanted to smash. "What will you do now?" I asked her. "I'm leaving," she said. "The lawyers say I can walk away from the debts since I didn't sign the commercial guarantees. I'm going back to my sisters in Oregon. But I couldn't go without seeing you. I couldn't go without knowing you were safe." I realized then that in the wreckage of my family, a strange new bond had formed. We were no longer the unwelcome burden and the distant daughter-in-law. We were the survivors of Julian Sterling's greed. "I have $15 million, Elena," I said, a dry chuckle escaping my throat. "And for the first time in my life, I have absolutely no one to give it to." Julian thought he was killing me for a fortune, but all he did was ensure the fortune would never reach him. He traded a father's love for a prison cell, and he didn't even get the money. As she stood to leave, she leaned over and kissed my forehead. It was the first time she had ever touched me with genuine affection. "Stay strong, Silas," she said. "Don't let the bitterness be the last thing you taste." After she left, I ordered a glass of water from room service. When it arrived, I looked at the clear, simple liquid for a long time before drinking. It tasted like nothing. It tasted like life. And as I lay down to sleep, I began a plan. Not a will, not a trust, but a way to use those $15 million to ensure that no other elderly person would ever have to feel like a ghost in their own home. The trial of Julian Sterling was not the grand spectacle the media expected. It was a quiet, clinical dissection of a soul's decay. I sat in the front row of the courtroom, my hands draped over the silver handle of my walker, watching the back of my son's head. He looked smaller in his orange jumpsuit, the expensive tailoring of his former life replaced by the coarse fabric of the state. He refused to look back at me. I think he was afraid that if he saw my eyes, he might see the ghost he had tried so hard to create. The prosecution's case was a grim tapestry of digital footprints and chemical receipts. They presented the search history from his laptop, chilling queries about anticoagulant toxicity in the elderly and how to simulate a myocardial infarction. They showed the security footage from a hardware store 3 towns over, where Julian, wearing a low-slung baseball cap, purchased 2 large containers of high-grade rat poison. The most damning evidence, however, was the 911 recording. The jury sat in a silence, so thick it was suffocating as Julian's own voice filled the room, frantic and weeping, confessing to a crime he thought had claimed the wrong victim. I put it there. His voice echoed from the speakers, distorted but unmistakable. It was for my father. I thought Elena drank it. Please, you have to save her. I watched the jurors' faces. They looked at Julian with a mixture of pity and profound disgust. To kill for passion is a human tragedy, but to kill with a calculator, to measure out the life of the man who gave you yours in exchange for a bank balance, is a different kind of evil. It is a crime against the very concept of family. When it was my turn to take the stand, the room went so quiet I could hear the hum of the air conditioning. The defense attorney, a man who looked like he hadn't slept since the indictment, approached me with a forced, gentle tone. He tried to suggest that Julian was under extreme psychological duress, that the weight of the $2 million debt had caused a temporary break from reality. Mr. Sterling, the attorney asked, did your son ever show signs of violence toward you before that morning? Did he ever threaten you? No, I replied, my voice steady despite the 92 years of weight behind it. He didn't use his fists. He used his absence. He made me feel like I was already dead so that when he finally tried to kill me, it would just feel like a formality. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. The verdict was guilty on all counts: attempted first-degree murder, elder abuse, and financial fraud. As the judge read the sentence, life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years, I felt no surge of joy. Julian would be nearly 70 years old before he could even dream of breathing free air again. By then, I would be long gone, a name on a headstone he would never visit. In the aftermath of the sentencing, I began the grueling task of liquidating the empire Julian had tried to steal. I sold the coastal mansion, the European cars, and the various properties that had become monuments to his greed. I didn't want the $15 million to sit in a bank account, growing stagnant like the green juice in that glass. I established the Sterling Foundation for Elder Dignity. Most of the fortune went into creating a network of high-quality, community-focused living centers where the elderly aren't treated like unwelcome burdens or biological clocks, but like the living libraries they are. I made sure these centers were filled with light, music, and, most importantly, conversation. No one would eat alone in their room unless they chose to. No one would feel like a ghost in a house they helped build. As for the rest of the money, I sent a significant portion to Elena. She had moved to Oregon and started over, working at a small nursery. She sent me a letter a few weeks ago, a simple note with a dried larkspur flower inside. It said, I finally have a garden that is mine, Silas. Thank you for giving me a life that isn't a lie. I still live in a small, sunny apartment within the first community center I built. I spend my mornings sitting in the courtyard, watching the birds and talking to the other relics who call this place home. My hands still shake and my walker still clicks against the floor, but I'm no longer waiting to die. I am busy sharing stories with people who actually want to hear them. Sometimes a young person will visit, a volunteer, or a grandchild of one of the residents, and they'll ask me the secret to a long life. I always give them the same answer. I tell them that life isn't about the money you accumulate or the mansions you build. It's about the people you choose to love and the honesty you bring to that love. I think back to that Tuesday morning often. I think about the glass of green juice and the son who smiled at me while he held my death in his hands. I've forgiven him, not because he deserves it, but because carrying the weight of that betrayal would be a slower poison than the one he tried to give me. My heart is still beating. It's a strong, stubborn heart that has survived the worst a sun could do. And as the sun sets over the courtyard, I take a deep breath of the evening air. It doesn't smell like citrus cleaner or expensive marble. It smells like earth, like flowers, and like the truth. I sit here now on the small balcony of my apartment at the Sterling Foundation as the sky turns a bruised purple and gold. This is the hour I used to fear most in Julian's mansion, the hour of the long shadows, when the house would grow quiet and the weight of being unwanted would settle into my bones like a winter chill. But here, the evening is different. I can hear the distant, comforting clatter of porcelain from the communal dining hall and the low, melodic hum of a cello playing somewhere in the gardens below. It is the sound of life continuing, not because it has to, but because it is cherished. People often ask me if I hate him. They look at me with pitying eyes, wondering how a man can carry the memory of his own child's hand, offering him a cup of execution. But hate is a young man's game. It requires a fire in the belly that I have long since traded for peace. To hate Julian would be to let him win. It would mean that the poison he prepared finally reached its mark, not in my veins, but in my spirit. I choose instead to remember the boy he was before the world told him that a man's worth is measured in the height of his glass towers and the weight of his bank accounts. I wrote to him once, about a year into his sentence. I didn't ask for an explanation, and I didn't offer a lecture. I simply told him about the gardens here. I told him that the $15 million he saw as a life raft was actually a seed. It has grown into a forest of sanctuary for hundreds of people who were once ghosts, just like me. I told him that I hoped, in the silence of his cell, he could find a way to forgive himself for believing that a father's life was worth less than a ledger of debts. He never wrote back, but I am told he keeps the letter in his Bible. That is enough for me. If you're listening to this story, perhaps sitting in your own home or driving through the noise of your own busy life, I have one final lesson for you. The kind of lesson you only earn after 9 decades of breathing and one morning of nearly stopping. We live in a world that is obsessed with the next promotion, the next purchase, the next inheritance. We treat time like a currency we can spend, and we treat the elderly like a spent battery, no longer useful to the machine. But the real wealth isn't in the $15 million. It isn't in the marble floors or the coastal views. The real wealth is the now. It is the ability to sit across from someone you love and truly see them, to ask about their day and actually wait for the answer, to realize that every person you pass, no matter how slow their gait or how wrinkled their skin, is a library of wisdom, a survivor of 1,000 storms you will never have to face. Don't wait for a green juice moment to realize what someone means to you. Don't let the polite silence of obligation replace the messy, beautiful noise of genuine connection. Because when the sirens finally fade and the lawyers go home, all that remains is the truth of how we treated one another when we thought no one was looking. My 92nd year was supposed to be my last, according to Julian's calculations. But here I am, approaching my 94th, and my heart has never felt lighter. I don't drink special juices anymore. I drink water, I drink tea, and occasionally I share a glass of fine wine with my neighbor, a retired school teacher who tells me stories of the children she taught 40 years ago. We are two relics, yes, but we are shining. The sun has finally dipped below the horizon now, and the first stars are beginning to wink through the twilight. I'm going to head inside soon. There's a chess game waiting for me in the lobby, and I am told my opponent is particularly formidable tonight. My walker will click against the floor, and my breath may be short, but I will be smiling. And this time, the smile will be real. Thank you for listening to my journey. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone you love today. Remind them that they are seen, that they are wanted, and that they are never a burden. Until we speak again, cherish the time you have, for it is the only thing we can never truly buy back. Good night.